All right, Daniele Boleli, the man, the myth, the legend. Thank you very much for coming on today. I really appreciate having you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so we were just chatting there about my first time in Italy there before, but it was about a month ago. So our school took about 30 students over to Italy, and one of the first things that I thought was interesting was like you were from Italy, now living in the U.S., and I live in Canada, so a pretty similar like indigenous history where there's a lot of kind of discussion about like residential schools and guilt and all that stuff kind of baked into our kind of political discourse. And then you go over to Italy and there's just like monument after monument after monument of just like, look at this great power that we once were, of just like annihilating civilizations, but we did it because we're the best. And I was talking to one of the other chaperones, and actually said to me, he was like, he's not from Canada. He's from Jamaica. He's like, "Look, man, you guys are the only ones that feel bad about it." So, like, what are
Yeah,
your thoughts on that, I guess?
I mean, I guess it's weird too because when you go back to something like the Roman Empire, who are those guys? Because it's like if you are from Italy
Mhm.
today, are you really related? Or odds are you maybe even have more blood from the people who came to destroy the Roman Empire. Or, it's like it's a cluster of just about every ethnicity that went through Europe at the time or for the past 2000 plus years. So, I mean, you get like some, usually on one side of the political spectrum, some folks who go into this very nationalistic, we are the heirs of ancient
Mhm.
Rome. But the reality is that it's probably not. Probably, when you look at
Yeah.
who the people are ethnically, historically, and all of it, in a country like Italy, and in many, or realistically, most countries where people have invaded over and over and over and over again, you can pretty much take your pick of whichever group you decide to claim descent from, because you're probably a mix of all of them. So you're probably, maybe there is a little connection to some Roman from 2500 years ago, and there's probably more connection to somebody who got enslaved in Gaul by Caesar, and there's probably a
Yeah.
connection by the guys who came a few hundred years later invading the remnants of the Roman Empire, and there's probably, and you go down the list, and so like the whole idea of being Italian today having really any connection to ancient Rome, probably not.
And I thought it was hilarious too because like even like our tour guides that we had throughout the trip, because we went from like we started in Milan, went through like Turin and Parma, Modena, and then like went down through Florence and Rome at the end. And like
Yep.
people from the north were like, oh, people from the south are, and the
Oh
people
yeah.
from the south were like, oh, those people from the north are like,
I mean, not
which
even
I get. It's kind of,
like that's step
I was
one.
gonna say, it's almost like not
Honestly,
refreshing.
yeah, it
Yeah.
gets even worse because you have people from 50 miles away who hate each other. You know what I mean? It's like it's north and south as long as you're looking at the whole nation. But when you look smaller, you're like, oh, those people
Mhm.
from that town down there is like, it's literally 50 miles away. It's like, yeah, they are a totally different city from us.
Well, I think too, it was Modena or Modena, and I want to say I could be wrong, but is it Parma that where Maserati was from, and then Ferrari
And where
had
it was from,
Modena,
I
and
forget.
that was like, but yeah, it was like that was the big rivalry, and it literally took 10 minutes to drive from place to place. I know, it was kind of funny,
Yeah.
but even as you're because like now you're like a lecturer on pretty much everything. Like, how
Hmm.
do you kind of balance your History on Fire podcast, which is fantastic? I haven't listened to it in a little bit, but I remember listening to it a few years ago. Um, and now that how do you kind of like make time for such like a vast project? And like I guess how do you find your like moments of inspiration to kind of go deeper on these things?
I mean, as far as choosing topics and things like that is, I have a long list. Even back when I started making a list of all the historical topics that I either know a lot about and I'm interested because I already know it, or I really don't know much, but I would love to know more. And as you may imagine, a list like that is never ending. You have hundreds of items. And then, when you start
Yeah.
looking a little deeper, some are like, okay, that's cool in theory, but there really is not much. There are not that many sources, so I can talk about this stuff for 5 minutes because there's
Mhm.
honestly not much. Or no,
Yeah.
here there are great characters, there's a great story, and then it's exciting, and then you're like, oh, I should pursue this one. This should be a good one. This should be. So I think, and then when you have partially it's just the discipline of just sticking to it and doing research more or less all the time
Mhm.
and reading and is if I didn't have to do it, like for the podcast, I would still do it because I enjoy it. But of course,
Mhm.
I would do it at a
Yeah.
much more relaxed pace. Because of the podcast, I keep the
Mhm.
pace higher than it would be if I didn't have to crank out content. But no, overall, I've been having great time with it. I started the podcast in 2015, so it's now 9 years by now. Um,
Wow.
it's great. I've had a great time with it. The topics that I still find now, I like them just as much as the ones that I first started with. So I feel that there's yeah, for somebody who never heard it, there's a lot of stuff that they can pick from. And maybe, they're like, I don't like this or that topic. No problem. There's so many others who are all different from one another where really you're bound to run into something
Mhm.
they are intrigued with.
Yeah, because I even noticed. So, do you have a separate podcast called The Drunken Taoist? Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so, 'cause I was looking at that, and I know like the basic concept, like the yin and the yang, and like everything in equilibrium. Maybe that's even the wrong word, but like, what is Taoism? And like, what
So,
kind of like connected that to you?
so I guess I'll give you two separate answers. One is Drunken Taoist specifically. I mean, definitely there's a lot of Taoism that makes its way into the podcast, but honestly, that podcast is about everything and anything I feel like chatting about. Sometimes there are guests, sometimes there
Mhm.
aren't, sometimes there's a relation to Taoism, sometimes there isn't, So that one is a calderon of so many different things. If we talk about Taoism
Sometimes
specifically,
the drunken part comes out a bit more.
yeah, yeah, exactly. If we talk about Taoism specifically, Taoism is you can look at it in many ways. It's on one level, it's a philosophy as found in the Tao Te Ching or Chuanzu. On one end, in China, it also became a religious practice where people took some of the philosophical ideas, mixed it with animistic traditions, and made it a religious practice. In some cases, it's more of a practical aspect to Taoism in the sense that Taoist philosophy has infused so many aspects of Chinese culture, from the martial arts to medicine
Mhm.
to you name it, that you may not consciously, you may have never studied Taoism philosophically, you may have never approached it religiously, but you apply it because it's a part of your field. It finds a lot of the principles in Taoist ideas. But basically, Taoism is a way of
Mhm.
looking, unlike typical religions or even most philosophies, it's not trying to convince anybody that come join us. If anything, Taoists tend to be kind of elitist. There's a thing of like, it's too complicated for most of you guys. Don't bother. Just go to Confucianism. That will give you simple rules, and you won't get hurt yourself like that.
Yeah.
Taoism so is sort of as an explanation of how the universe works, of basic principles of how nature works. And nature is what Taoism is all about, right? Not just nature as in the trees and the mountains, but like learning the things that are at the roots of the universe that then apply to human life, apply to interaction, apply to
Mhm.
communication, apply. Their idea is that those principles, once you figure them out, apply to every single thing. And your ability to apply those principles in real time, because Taoism has the sense of flexibility, that things are in constant motion. So you cannot apply the answer you found yesterday to this one issue identical to this new issue that pops up today. The one from yesterday informs your answer today, but it's probably things have changed a little.
Mhm.
And so the ultimate Taoist talent is the ability to read the situation and make the right adjustments accordingly. And so it's really not dogmatic, but there are these principles that are inviting you to essentially learn how to apply them. The idea being, if you learn how to
Mhm.
apply them, your daily life will be considerably easier because you'll be a better communicator, and you can go down the list because it applies to pretty much anything. And if you mess them
Mhm.
up or you understand them only intellectually, but you can't quite read the situation right, your life will be harder because it's like swimming against the current rather than with it. There
Yeah.
is no moral dimension there. It's not that you're sinful if you mess it up. It's more like you just made a dumb call. That's just how it works. Whereas if you had made a smart call, your life would have been easier.
Interesting. Yeah, because I've always like again like heard the symbolism of it and stuff, but it just seems like a kind of like a guiding practice, which is again pretty much like most religion or any sort of philosophy. And kind of touching back to your other podcast of History on Fire, I guess like in some of the work I've heard you or other podcasts I've heard you on, one of the main themes that kind of come up is the difference between like a historian and a storyteller. So, how like are there things that you kind of look back on your first episode in 2015 versus how you tell a story now, where you're like, I don't know what I was doing back then, but now you kind of laugh at in retrospect?
No, I think because by the time I started the podcast, I'd been teaching history for 14 years. So I had a sense of both how to catch people
Hmm.
attention because I never assumed that my students owe me their attention. The idea was always I need to earn their attention, so I need to make this interesting and relevant. Otherwise, why should they listen to me? And so that was part of it, the storyteller aspect. I need to make it engaging. And then the other part is because I've been doing history so long, I knew, what it takes to
Hmm.
really know your sources, to really be able to be accurate and do that stuff. So in that regard, by the time I started the podcast, it was enough of a well-oiled machine to have that approach to how
Hmm.
to convey history in a way that's both accurate and entertaining, that honestly there hasn't been much change between then and now. There it has been very much I feel that really I don't find that neither the quality nor the amount of work that I put into it has changed all that much.
Hmm. Okay, so what about even like when you started lecturing? Like, what were like when you started lecturing? Do you think it was always kind of natural to you to be able to like come up with those hooks pretty easily, or?
Yeah, but of course you get better. You start lecturing and you hit
Hmm.
it. You're doing a good job. Maybe it's decent enough, and you're like, okay, kind of flows. But then each time you see people's reaction is like, oh, when I go there, I get a much faster reaction. When I go down this rabbit hole, I kind of lost them for 20 minutes. And so you're like, okay, don't go down this rabbit hole, do this other thing, and you essentially tighten the game where, maybe it starts out and is pretty good, but then as time goes by and you figure
Hmm.
out what people respond to and what not, you can tighten it and make it better.
Hmm. Yeah, because I would say that's probably one of my obviously still early on in my. 'Cause I'm not like a history professor. I'm like a secondary social studies teacher. So we go through. It's not just history, and I mean, you can only make the American and Canadian political systems so interesting when you're trying to like talk about it. Usually, I'll try to find up like some crazy examples, but and again, like I've always been of the camp where like, going through 4 years of sitting through history lectures, like I told my students every day, if I could just sit through lectures all day, every day, I would do it. Like
Yeah,
I absolutely loved it. Like I never noticed the time go by when I was
yeah.
in class. But and so I've never known what it's like to not appreciate or enjoy history. So that's kind of been a hard part for me of like, how do you guys not enjoy this kind of thing? Now, obviously, I usually bring enthusiasm to the
Yeah.
class, and usually it can start to come out, and usually like you're catching eyeballs. But now the phones in class is a whole other thing. But do you find that you have a problem with that in your history lectures, like still as a professor?
I don't care. To me, it's like, especially, I mean, for me, it's different because they are adults, right? To me, it's like they are
Yeah,
adults who choose to be there. They are not kids who have to be there. So it's a little
yeah,
bit of a different game. But the way I see it is you guys are
hmm,
adults. Be here, don't be here, pay attention, don't pay
hmm.
attention. That's on you. It's like, I'm not your mom, I'm not a cop, I'm not here to make you
I'm
stick
not a
to,
cop.
it's like, I'm here to do my job. You want to engage with it, great. You don't want to,
Yeah.
by all means, be my guest. I get it. Maybe you have other stuff on your mind. Maybe for whatever reason you don't care. Totally fine by me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I even like I teach grade 11 and 12, mostly like the highest grades in the high school level. So I still like I'm pretty much same boat where I'm like logical consequence. We have assessments. If you kind of poop the bed on it, that's not a me
Yeah,
thing. That's a you thing. Like we're just trying to figure this out. Um, and so I've kind of thought about this of like the more you study history, the more you pretty much get into things that like you'll tell other people the story and they're just so alarmed by it, but like you almost become numb to the extreme nature of not like humanity, but the stories you hear. So hypothetically, if I was your historical therapist, what are like the stories that just absolutely stick in your mind that just come up and you're like, I just still can't believe that, or just sits with you?
I
Like, what
mean,
are one or maybe a few that you have?
I think you said it right. Like you get desensitized a lot. Like there are things that
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a book that I assigned, and I always think of it as a really funny, hilarious book. And everybody's all bummed out, and I'm like, why? And then I'm like, oh, because they never heard these stories. So to me, it's like I've heard them so many times that I'm like, my accent is, oh, but look at that funny joke they made, or look at how they made it in a way that's more lighthearted. But for people who had never been exposed, maybe
Yeah.
like this book is the Dull Nights of Pine Ridge is all about native history in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so, of course, there's a mountain of heavy, terrible stuff going down.
Yeah.
But I
What's
like
the
the
book?
fact that it's called The Dull Knives of Pine Ridge. It's about this family,
The
the Dull
Dull
Knives
Knives.
family.
Okay.
And it takes through late 1800s into late 1990s kind of thing about their life. And
Hmm.
and I always found it hilarious, like their sense of humor is brilliant. But of course, it's because I'm used to, I gloss over all the massacres and bloodshed and terrible things going down. I heard it 1,000 times. But of course, for people who haven't, is shocking, or sometimes, like for example, I just did now 2 episodes about, these are more recent history. I did 2 episodes about the 1970s and 1980s in El Salvador. And it's a
Hmm.
dark history. And US intervention in El Salvador, not directly, but by sending weapons and training and stuff to
Yep.
the government, is atrocious. I mean, and when you hear about it and you can gloss over it, get a vague sense. When you look at the real detailed accounts of what went down, it's so dark that even for me, I've been so used to dealing with some very heavy history. There were moments where, I mean,
Hmm.
there's even a moment in that I did 2 episodes, the second episode, where I'm reading some of these accounts. And there's a moment there where I remember stopping for like 4 or 5 seconds because I was like, I need to breathe here. This is heavy. This is really, really, and it happens, and I
So do
think
you
that
read out your
also,
episodes?
well, I mean, in this case, I was reading a quote. So yes, I was reading. Typically,
Okay,
what I
yes, fair
do
enough.
is
Yeah.
I kind of script it. I mostly script it.
Yep.
Then I also break away from the script because I don't want to feel like the listener is
Hmm.
feeling like I'm reading a thing to them. So I'll have it
Yep.
there, and if a part I
Hmm.
feel I wrote it really well, I'll read it. But most of the time, I'm gonna take a quick look and then sort of ad lib and be more spontaneous about what I just did in
Yep.
order to make it feel more
Hmm.
lively, make it feel less like a guy reading to you.
Authentic too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because otherwise it puts everyone to sleep.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. And everyone takes their phone out and all that stuff. So yeah, because I know even myself, like again, um, teaching history or being involved in history for about 7 years now. I guess like professionally, if you want to put air quotes around it. But I even noticed like the periods where you just have such knowledge gaps where like we kind of know like a little about a lot, but you don't really go that deep on that many things. Like I remember, like I really admired your podcast specifically because like my initial idea for a podcast a few years ago was to do one on just the Vietnam War,
Uh-huh.
but then I thought that was like almost too narrow, and I ended up abandoning it. And even like the areas, like obviously no one's not going to know everything about everything, but I almost find like when I was talking about the Vietnam War and going through the script, in my head I was thinking, okay, I'm kind of already reading or delivering things that have already been written, if that kind of makes sense. And so I always kind of struggled like what is my point of originality in kind of re-delivering these stories? And I don't, maybe struggle's the wrong word, but I guess like even for example, you did some on Teddy Roosevelt, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so that would be like a very renowned, highly studied figure. But I guess like going into that specific example, like what is your, I guess, ambition of originality in kind of creating that specific segment?
So there are two main things I would say. One is the fact that most
Mhm.
of the books that I read for research are written by people who can't write, who are just god awful writers. They are great researchers, they are good historians, they do not know how to
Yeah.
communicate to other human beings. So most of the time, half of my job in that regard is read a bunch of horrendously boring books, find nuggets that are like, no, the story is great, it's just poorly told, and then figure out a way to retell
Yeah.
it in a way that regular human beings would be intrigued with rather than putting them to sleep. So that's half of it. It's really just
Mhm.
about storytelling. It's how you tell the story in a more
Mhm.
with better pace, with better
Yeah.
examples, with that kind of stuff. The other half is,
Mhm.
I think, in connecting, making connections between things that most people do not. So, for example, like if I'm talking about Theodore Roosevelt, I'll bring up something about maybe because of my experience and what I'm into, I'll be talking a lot about combat sports because he was so into combat sports. And so I'll bring up some of the things related to
Mhm.
combat sports that typical presidential historians are going to kind of gloss over and may not really pay as much attention to. Or I'll bring up something, I'll connect it with something from a different time period, a different example that, again, specialists in the field may not make that connection. And for somebody who's not a specialist, will be like, oh, that's interesting. That's a cool parallel. I can see how this works.
Mhm.
And or even just pop culture references or things like that that feel like people recognize, and so they find a way to relate to themselves, to their life. In some cases I try to bring the human element, right? It's like Roosevelt has his
Mhm.
wife and his mom dying in the same day, and on the day when his
Oh.
firstborn daughter was born, right? So it's like you just became a father, you have this new baby, and your wife and your mom just died. And he goes into this deep depression, and his way of dealing with depression is just dive into action and just do things because it's so. Otherwise, if it sits still, this depression comes looming in. And so to me, it's interesting then talking about grief,
Oh.
how to handle those heavy, dark emotions. And, even somebody who does not give a crap about Theodore Roosevelt will be like, hell, I know my friend is depressed as hell. This is interesting. Or my brother died when I was 7. This I can relate to.
Mhm.
And that kind of stuff where people are, you'll find a human element where now it's more interesting because it's not just what this guy did, a list of presidential events. Is like a movie character. Now you're seeing history through this guy's eyes and you relate to some degree.
Hmm. I didn't know that about his wife and mother dying on the same day, but it
Yeah.
does kind of touch on like his hyperactive kind of personality. Because
Yep.
I pretty much like we pretty much gloss over the square deal and then go
Yep.
into like the ball moose party and how he pretty much got shot during his speech. Like when you're doing a semester on like
Oh yeah.
from 1780 to 1980, I mean, you can only have like your day, I guess, to talk about Teddy Roosevelt in that time. Um, but yeah, that's so one of the other things that I've noticed, not noticed, but one of the things I heard you touch on was like we kind of looked at what made like fascism stick in Italy specifically. Now, talking about the human element here specifically for you, you told the story about your hardcore grandmother
Sure.
working in the anti-fascist resistance. And I guess like being especially from northern Alberta myself, like it's almost when we went to Italy, not to get like too cheesy about traveling or anything, but you almost feel like attached to the human story
Hmm.
almost. Whereas like you're actually like you're seeing where Julius Caesar was cremated, like you're seeing the
Sure.
Colosseum and like you're hearing your tour guide say, "Oh, yeah, we actually built the Colosseum with the funds that we stole during the sack of Jerusalem." And you're like, "Whoa, like what?
Yeah.
Like how does like everything is?" And they'll be like, "Oh yeah, like Leonardo da Vinci, like he vacationed here." And it's like, "What?
Yeah.
Like how does that?" But I guess like being someone who is now kind of like a public espouser of history myself, I guess there's almost again like the imposter, and I don't mean to ramble too much here, but like the imposter feeling can almost creep up if you don't really have like an attachment to that story. So I guess like how has your kind of molding of where you were from and like your literally familial experience kind of like
Mhm.
influenced your perception of history?
I mean, I think there's definitely stories that are more personal in that regard. But again, it's
Hmm.
interesting what actually qualifies as more personal. Because maybe, yeah, if I'm doing a World War II in Italy, it's more personal because of direct family experience. Okay, there's that. But maybe
Hmm.
if you're covering Teddy Roosevelt, maybe you had to deal with grief. And so it's completely separate from your family or from even what you specialize in, but you
Hmm.
understand that aspect. And so that's when that you relate.
Hmm.
And maybe if you're doing, you know what I mean? Is like it can be pretty much any time, any period, but there may be something about that story that clicks for you on a very personal level. And it doesn't have to be just in the literal sense of family history or people you are related to are from that land and all of it. It may be
Hmm.
other aspects that click with you. And I think so in that regard it clicks on multiple levels. It clicks on like to me when like the example you use of like my grandma in World War II, which by the way is funny because I'm releasing that episode for the first time outside of any public walls tomorrow, so that's rather the
Okay,
timing is
good to know.
perfect. But like what happens is like that's obviously very relevant in some ways, but there are episodes about whatever topic from any time or any place that I relate to very
Hmm.
strongly for other reasons. And so to me is not just what your people or family or whatever has been through that makes it more relevant. There are other
Hmm.
factors too.
Well, yeah, because I'm admiring that because I guess for myself, like let's just say I wanted to write a book on Italian history of some sort, or I wanted to do like a lane or an episode kind of like yourself with History on Fire with like an episode about like the sack of Jerusalem. I
Yeah.
guess I've kind of always felt this like a fear of appropriation of kind of not actually being someone from the culture and getting into it. But I feel like you've really channeled the you're like, you know what? I'm not doing anything to insult anything here. It's like I'm finding a story and I'm trying to channel the human component of that story.
Yeah, and I think it's good to listen to people, especially if it's not your history in that
Hmm.
sense. It's good to not come in an arrogant way, like, let me tell you, or like really
Yeah.
listen to. But, I've done a lot, for example, I've done a ton of episodes on Native American history. I never had a single case of a Native person telling me there was an issue with it. If anything, I had the opposite. I had a
Yeah.
ton of native people reach out going like, holy shit, this is amazing. This is what I wanted. This was the history. And
Yeah.
I'm this Italian guy doing that, and that's what I love too, that to them, that didn't matter. If I screwed it up, it mattered. It's
Hmm.
like, I'm Italian guy trying to tell native history and you can't. But because I hit it right, according to them, they are like, no, this is great. We like you. You're cool. And so to me, it's like, of course, you need to
Yeah.
approach it with a certain level of respect and being very clear that, yeah,
Hmm.
that you're not talking about your own personal history or culture. But at the same
Hmm.
time, like I've had that experience. Like I still teach, actually. I've been teaching one of these two departments. I've been teaching in American Indian Studies beside history for 20 plus years.
Hmm.
And I think in that department currently, I think I'm the only non-native person who teaches in that department. I've also taught some classes for a few years in Asian American studies. And guess what? I'm not exactly Asian American, and every single other person teaching in the department was Asian American. Why is
Hmm.
it that it was okay for me to do it? I really think is it's a mix of like what I brought to the table was something that was appreciated regardless of my ethnicity or not. I think I brought a certain sensitivity to the
Hmm.
topic that wasn't arrogant, that wasn't trying to be, I know the history better than you do. There was acknowledging
Yeah.
points of views that are personal for people that, yeah, but it's not a right or wrong thing. It's depend on how you do it. Two people could be doing the exact
Hmm.
same thing, and one does it with the wrong inflection, the wrong attitude. and the whole discussion
Yeah.
of cultural appropriation will kick in because it feels fake. Somebody else will do it and people are cool with it.
Yeah. Because I feel like if anything, like bringing showing, looking at your podcast, just list of episodes, you have a genuine curiosity about like so many different things. So you're not there to kind of overtake or overstep.
Mhm.
But it's interesting you say that because in my own experience, just anecdotally, like I've noticed that when I would be in like major like seminar courses or anything like that, like there was a lot of ego and arrogance in like a
Mhm.
history class.
Sure.
And maybe I don't know if that was like my own potential, like my own fear of messing up or insecurity, whatever, what have you. But have you had that experience with like your own students at all? And I don't really know kind of what I'm asking. Maybe I'm not even asking a question, but I always just found there was like more of a competition nature in history, which I didn't expect, than more of like a mutual learning. And maybe
I
that's
think
kind of just where I studied and like my specific context. But
Yeah, I think people, like even people who maybe walk in on the first day of class and they're like, why the hell is this guy teaching me about my people history kind of thing? I never have a problem
mhm,
with that because I know that within 2 weeks we're gonna get along kind of thing. I know that by the
yeah.
time so it always ends up working out. I mean, I even had like one time was
Hmm.
rough because it was a course that was taught by, it was an ethnic studies course where there's an African American person teaching African American studies, Chicano Latino person teaching Chicano Latino studies, Asian Am teaching Asian Am, and then there was me teaching Native American, and then the person who was teaching before was a native elder from California and all of it, and I'm stepping in their shoes. And not only just the students, but even my other three colleagues are probably looking at me like, who the hell is this guy? But in fairness, they did it with, there was a challenge there. There was an element of, let's see what you bring to the table. But after the first lecture, they were all cool with me. They were all like, oh, it works. Good job. We like it. I like the attitude that you bring to it. And so it was like, it wasn't yes or no. I think if I handled it poorly, I would have been the annoying white guy doing stuff that he wasn't supposed to. But the way, I guess I don't know if it was the humor, if it was whatever the hell it was, but something
Hmm.
that they like, where they are like, no, you're cool, you can, it's fine.
Yeah. The Italians always get a pass. So
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
I
just
think
kidding.
every else,
Um,
nobody understands the word I'm saying. They just see me animated and smiling and stuff, and then they're like, I guess he's cool.
well, no, I think it's like you don't embody like oh, I do this like content to show that I know more than you. I
Mhm.
show that I like to learn and I like
Yeah.
to like produce communities of learning, not actually trying to do that. Um, so I guess this is kind of like a personal question for myself. I just got a couple more to ask you. I won't keep you too much longer. Um, like right now, I'm 27, and like I went through like high school, university, all that stuff, and right now it's like I have a history degree, an education degree, blah blah blah. But like this is the first year. So I started the podcast about a year ago, and but it's the first year I'm not in like any new coursework. And it's like the first year that I'm like I'm teaching the same courses 2 years in a row. Now next year I'm moving to New Brunswick and that'll be a whole other challenge. But it was weird not being in like an environment of just learning for the first time. And I actually almost had like a weird like intellectual fear of missing out or like a midlife crisis almost
Sure.
intellectual or like academically maybe is the better word. Have you ever had an experience like that, or like how did you kind of? I guess this is kind of what I seek inspirations like through talking to people like you. I just find that's the people I enjoy talking to. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's something to be said when you deliver the same lecture for the 300th time. It does get old, inevitably. I think a way to
Yeah.
make it get old less and less fast is to, in a way, think that you're acting. You're like an actor on a stage. And so you are the same way as you do the same take in a movie 30 times. You're doing the same lecture and you sometimes throw in the same joke because it works, but you have heard it 300 times. They have not. So if you can deliver it like it's the first
Yes.
time you do it, then it works. If you deliver it like it's the 300th time you do
Mhm.
it, it doesn't. So it's almost like you have to put yourself into that energy of like the first time you are reading
Yeah.
something or lecturing, even though it's not.
Mhm.
And of course, it's easier said than done because you do it enough times and it gets a little harder each time to bring a freshness to it.
Yep.
But in some ways, it's always good to be reminded, I'm getting paid to talk about stuff I like. I could be a
Yeah.
coal miner in Bulgaria and it would be less fun. And
Yeah.
so it's like bring the freshness already,
No,
it's not
I
that,
100% agree with that.
so it's kind of like,
No, I
if
totally
you
agree, and, like, I
properly,
wouldn't say yeah, and I guess my thing it wasn't even that I don't enjoy, because again, I've only been, like, fully lecturing and teaching, I guess, for a few years, and so I thoroughly enjoy, like, the moments that you're in it and you're teaching and the kids are only half of them are on their phones, not all of them,
yeah.
but it was just weird, like, not being like, "Oh, I don't have a paper to write," or, like, a major project to work on, or, like, something I had to submit with a deadline. I always just thought it was kind of a weird change of pace. But yeah, I guess this will be my outlet for now. So I got two more things to ask you, my friend, before I let you go. There's kind of like two quotes that I've been kind of like finishing off the shows with so far. One was, "Don't let school get in the way of your education." So we've probably been a theme so far for you and I discussing about like find the story that needs to be told, find a way to make it interesting. Um, these are things that are not you read in a book and then you kind of regurgitate. But like, what are some of the things you think is like necessary, not even for teachers or educators or historians, but like people in general to learn as they kind of move through their career?
I mean, I guess it depends on everybody has different interests, but figuring out what your interests are and read about it and look what's out there and maybe get a peripheral interest that you didn't think was a big deal, but you started, basically just having intellectual curiosity more than any one specific thing. I
Mhm.
think is, most people don't read. Most people stop reading if they read anything after high school or college at most. That obviously is not an
Mhm.
ideal kind of scenario. So having some intellectual curiosity for things out there is important. Just make it a practice. To really nothing beats reading in that regard.
Mhm. Beautiful. All right, so one more. It's education is what remains once we forget everything that we learned in school.
Mhm.
Other than obviously the killer accent, what is it that students are going to get from a class with you, Mr. or Professor Boleli, that they won't get with anyone else?
It's interesting, like that quote you read, speaking of Taoism, that's a very Taoist concept. The Taoists have this idea that, initially people accumulate knowledge, and the difference is they go from ignorant, where they have no knowledge, to being knowledgeable when they carry all this knowledge. In the Taoist idea is like, and then the real learning happens when you get rid of all of it. And it's like, wait, why would I get rid of all? I struggle so hard to acquire it. It's like, because that knowledge is just a
Mhm.
bunch of rocks you're carrying in your head at that point. It's a weight. Whereas when you get
Yeah.
rid of like the specific notion, the specific little nitpicky, it turns into wisdom. Like what you remember, what you will embody, what you will carry with you is the stuff that apply to life. And those would be more principles, ideas, a sensitivity,
Mhm.
and understanding that. For example, one of the main human diseases is the tendency to be really dogmatic and being very black and white about things. And instead, if you can do nothing else but instill a taste for nuance, instill a taste that for every statement you make, there's usually an end where there's another aspect that doesn't, or you could say a but if you say that is antithetical to some degree, where it's like, yeah, this is true, this is also true. And don't forget, just because you found
Mhm.
30% of stuff that's absolutely accurate, don't make it 100%, because there are other aspects to the story that makes it a little more complicated. And so I think like the ability to think in terms that accept that one thing and its opposite sometimes can be true at the same time, and figuring out the balance of how much each, and really
Mhm.
thinking. I like the word nuance in that regard, because it forces you to think in terms that are less dogmatic, less black and white, and more real ultimately, because that's how real life is.
Beautiful. Couldn't have said it any better myself. Thank you very much for coming on today, sir. It's been a pleasure having you.
Cool. Thank you so much.